Welcome to Session 7 of the 9 Elements of a Person-Centered System. Today, we're focused on organizational culture. Your presenters today are myself, Michael Smull, Tanya Richmond, Bob Sattler, and Mary Lou Bourne. If we look at our focus for today, our primary focus is the impact of organizational culture. But as we look at organizational culture, we need to look at the impact of an unhealthy culture. What are the typical components and how do you begin to address them? And how do you support a healthy culture? Finally, based on what you hear, what changes might you do based on the learning? And if we think about organizational culture as an image, we have two elephants holding up a banner, and in the circle on the banner, there are hands going around because organizational culture is about supporting each other. And if you think about what do we mean by culture, one of the classic definitions is culture is how you address and solve everyday problems. Culture is the sea in which we swim. Like fish, we're unlikely to notice the sea. It just surrounds us as part of what is just there. But it defines what the cultural norms are, defines what's encouraged, what's discouraged, what's accepted, and what's rejected. And importantly, if we look at many of the change efforts that have taken place that you've participated in, what you see is culture is the silent killer of change. Where you have an unhealthy culture, where there's significant flaws in the culture, culture will have the impact on change such that the change does not occur, just doesn't happen.
Thank you, Michael. So if we really think about the impact of organizational culture, as Michael says, it really is that underlying current that exists within the organization, and it really is something that requires ongoing attention. It is one of the most important factors that thinks about how we move forward and how our employees move forward with us. Often we think that organizational culture is responsibility of the human resources department, that it's their job to come up with a strategy to improve the culture of the organization and to monitor how it's going. Unfortunately, this often leads us down a path where the culture of the organization eats that strategy for breakfast. It really is necessary for all employees, especially those in leadership and supervisory positions, to address culture constantly. It's not the role of one department. We all need to be contributing to the culture that we want in the organization, because culture really has taken years to develop and solidify. And it's going to take some time to change the culture to be the culture that you want it to be for your organization. Culture can either be unhealthy or healthy. And when we think about unhealthy cultures, we see that no one really follows the rules or the protocols. We say that meetings start on time, yet people straggle in because we know we've got that human service buffer of 15 minutes before a meeting really starts. We say we're a transparent organization, yet employees never know what is going on unless you happen to be a friend of the boss, and then you find things out. We say we're a person-centered organization, but we don't treat our employees the way we expect them to treat those using our services and supports. There's a lack of continuity. This leads to unhappy employees, a lack of good morale, and high turnover. The bad employees of the organization tend to drive out the good. When we think about a healthy work culture, we often find cohesiveness and teamwork. People work together for the common good. There's a sense of purpose, and employees feel that they truly are a part of something. In these organizations, we tend to see that there tends to be high retention. In fact, have you ever walked into an organization and you just get a vibe about how it operates, regardless of the platitudes and plaques you see on the wall about how good they are? You just get a feel for how people are treating each other, what the demeanor of the organization is. We can feel the type of culture in an organization. In unhealthy cultures, and this is work that is actually taken from Michael Hewitt, who is from the Thomas Nelson Publishing Company, and did a lot of work on what cultures are all about. And in unhealthy cultures, they have found that they tend to be hierarchical, and the emphasis is following that hierarchy. There's no open door policy. It's you follow the chain of command and don't question things. As we've already talked about, there's an opaqueness in the terms of communication. No one truly knows what's going on unless you happen to be in that inner circle. We often find that in unhealthy organization cultures that there is fear and conformity to motivate employees. You know, and often makes me think of something Michael often used to say that he took from the Far Side cartoons, which is a ship where you see a captain overseeing all of the people who are rowing the boat, and a caption that says the beatings will continue until morale improves. Not really going to happen. There tends to be a focus on short-term results. Let's fix this and then we are done with it, rather than thinking about long-term strategies. And people are always looking for the next big win. How can we really get there without really having a process in place to make that happen? We often find that there is internal competition, that we have that watch your back type of mentality. And that doesn't really lead to an organization that moves forward collectively. Oftentimes, as we've already talked about, there is little regard to following the policies, the processes, and the procedures that are in place. The people who get rewarded are the ones that know the people in leadership positions rather than how they perform and do their job duties. I think we've all had experience with someone in a position of authority that may not have the experience to be in that position, but they happen to know the right person and got promoted. In unhealthy cultures, people are taken for granted. And because of that, people don't feel invested in the organization. They're not recognized for the accomplishments and talents and skills that they have. And it really makes it hard to be part of something that doesn't appreciate you. And they tend to be monolithic and homogeneous in regard to the gender, ethnicity, or even the location. We don't see any diversity. We don't see any collaborative efforts across genders, across ethnicities. It tends to be very, well, as it says here, monolithic and homogeneous. So we really want to think about what type of organization do we have? Do we have some of these components going on in our organization?
So what do we see in the organizations that we work with that tell us that things need to change? First and most common is blame culture. Some of us grew up in blame culture families, where the response to something that's gone awry is to say, who did it? Whose fault is it? And there's punishment. And yet punishment rarely changes behavior. If you want to change behavior, you need to catch people doing things right. And if you want to change something that went awry, you need to understand why it happened. You need to be able to do a deep dive and find out what the root cause is. And a blame culture will kill a learning culture every day. But one of the other issues you're looking at, which is a relative of blame culture, is the idea of pervasive cynicism. If you want change to happen, you have to have discontent. Happy people see no reason to change. So you expect to have and you need to have discontent if you want change. But it turns out there's two kinds of discontent, optimistic and cynical. People who have optimistic discontent are unhappy with some aspects of the issues, but expect that they can change them. It may take time, it may take effort. They believe that change is possible, change can happen. The cynics, those people with cynical discontent, agree that things are bad, things need to change, and they'll agree on what needs to change, but they won't agree that it will change. They see the discontent that they have is grounded in the idea that we need change, but it won't happen. They often have what we like to call Eeyore syndrome, where we're saying, oh dear, things are bad, but they're going to get worse. A piece of this also is what can be referred to as vision derision. We've focused a lot on the importance of having a vision, having a mission, and sharing it. But if people see the vision as something that is superficial, pie in the sky, a nice idea, but not something that's going to be achieved, then you're seeing vision derision. You're seeing people who are, again, have cynical discontent. But you also have in our system what we refer to as crisis culture, where things need solutions, but we don't feel that we have the time to really solve it. We only have the time to give it a Band-Aid. So instead of finding a way to achieve real resolution, what we find is a way to be able to deal with it immediately, but not thoroughly, and then move on and hope it doesn't come back. But crises that aren't resolved reappear. And if you keep having reappearing crises, you wind up with crisis culture. And you actually have people who wind up being addicted to crisis culture. They see themselves as like the gunslingers of the Old West, people who can ride into town, shoot the problem, and ride out. And if you have crisis culture, people who are trying to take the time do not get respect. They're seen as people how quickly things need to be done. And then finally, there's the focus on compliance that overrides being able to accomplish the vision and the spirit of the vision and the spirit of the rule rather than just the letter. And again, it gets into time. We don't have time to do it the right way. We just have time to be in compliance. And all of these tend to mitigate against real change that sticks. Where you have an excessive compliance culture, you have a culture in which good paper takes precedence over a good life. Whereas we know that the mission and vision is about helping people get good lives. But efforts to get good lives are not noticed. And the behaviors of senior managers tells the frontline managers that good paper is rewarded and bad paper is punished. People who use services may wind up with good plans, but lives are what matters. One of our colleagues who ran a really forward-thinking agency used to say, if we get an A on lives and a C on paper, we're doing okay. So is the focus on the vision and helping people get a life, or is the vision on compliance? I'll now turn it over to Tanya.
So perpetual crises are generated by a culture that actually prizes heroism. And in our culture, we really do think a lot about heroes. That's a narrative that's pretty popular in our culture. If your organization, if your agency or your department leans in that direction, here are some things that may be actually underlying that. So because heroism is addictive, it's not a sign of commitment. So you only have time for the quick fix. Or all of the solutions are permanent now. They're not temporary solutions anymore until there's a new crisis that comes along and we have to figure out a new temporary solution. Then that becomes permanent. Time to think things through is seen as a luxury. And in places where there's always a crisis, stopping to think is not a luxury, it's necessary. And those that are good at crisis management find it addictive. So the more we solve, the more we want to solve. So like the psychological phenomenon of hero syndrome, where someone creates a problem in order to be the hero, to save the day, organizational culture also creates this addiction that reward intrinsically and extrinsically the valiance of those who rush in to the fire and put them out. So people may be feeling the only way to get recognized is to be the hero, to display the heroic behaviors. If you thought about your own agency right now and made a checklist, how many of these things would be present where you work? Think about some examples that you might share when we get back together in person. If you only have time for a quick fix, are those fixes becoming permanent? Or do you wish you had more time to think things through? And that might be an indication that you had a crisis culture. Can you anticipate where the crises may happen? If you think about Maslow's hierarchy and how that may come into play, we had a bad fit, but we fix it temporarily and we kind of wait for things to blow up. So you have kind of a self-crisis mode. So look back through and think about things like referrals in your organization. How many times are you addressing a crisis through a referral? We need to be able to figure out how to predict a crisis. We know that these crises happen. We kind of know the nature of many crises before they happen. What can we put in place that helps mitigate some of this need to be a hero in those situations? And how do we enlist the people who are doing the work day to day to be partners in shutting down a crisis culture? Conversation that kind of runs through the organization, but not in the main public forums. You might see ambiguity about who's responsible for stuff at work, and also casting blame on outside parties. So we might see people blame the people who use services and support, blame the customers, or attempts to conceal mistakes. Because when there's a blame culture, people don't want to be called out for things that they've done wrong or that have been mistakes. But in a culture where there's more accountability, we see mistakes as part of the work that we do and how we learn. So we want to make sure that no one gets hurt, but we also want to make sure that we learn from the mistakes that we make and apply those forward, or so fail forward. Blame culture, we see this a lot in journalists, and it's where, it's that gotcha culture where they're trying to catch you doing something wrong. You have it if you try to figure out what responses may happen, and everyone is pointing in all directions. We might hear things like, whose job is this, when there's a mistake or something falls through the crack. And we might also hear, well, that depends. We don't really know. So that's not been clear to us. In blame culture, that's endemic. So if you grew up in a household that did this, it's hard to get rid of it altogether. It may not be uniquely seated in the organization that you're currently in, but people may actually come with that kind of built into them. So it's hard to get rid of it completely, but there are some things we can do to minimize blame culture. Everyone likes to think they think outside the box. But even if they are in the box, they may find themselves thinking along a certain line, and that often is connected to having a blame culture. So one of the hallmarks is to learn from mistakes and to, again, apply it forward in a culture that is healthy. In a blame culture, you don't see that. You just see people looking for who to pin this on. If you share solutions, you have a learning culture. And if you say, I hope no one finds out about this, then you can be pretty sure that you're in a blame culture. So, you have accountability when you understand what the boundaries are before you cross them. In a culture that is a blame culture, you may not know where those boundaries are. So there's not a lot of clarity about where the boundaries are, and you may step over them inadvertently. In a culture of accountability, people demonstrate high levels of taking ownership, having a strong work ethic, thinking and acting in the ways that they need to make sure that what stays in front of them at all times is the organizational results or the outcomes. So some of the defining characteristics of an accountability culture is that people voluntarily assume accountability rather than having someone tell them what they need to be accountable for. And they're enthusiastic about it. They take it upon themselves. They take pride in it. They're not to be commanded, and they don't have to be reminded to be accountable. And they also don't have to be watched. We don't have to keep people under surveillance and call them to task for their actions. So when we're in a culture of accountability, people at all the levels of the organizations are committed to making sure that they're keeping an eye on those organizational results and really working toward them because they see themselves as part of a team or part of the solutions, and they don't wait to be asked for a progress report or a follow-up plan. They report proactively. They want everyone to know where they stand in terms of moving towards that prize. And so they're measuring their own progress on an ongoing basis because they have this internalized need to carry out the commitment and achieve the results.
And then the last look at unhealthy cultures is that pervasive cynicism that Michael mentioned earlier. Really is that Eeyore syndrome, the we're never gonna make it. And people don't believe that change is going to happen. We've been down this road before. Person-centeredness has been around for 20 plus years, and it's had its starts and stops because people didn't believe that change may be necessary. So it's not going to happen. Or that it was just too pie in the sky. We can't do this for everybody. Our system just can't handle that. But now we're finding that we have to figure it out because we've got some mandates that are telling us we need to look at things a little bit differently. So maybe it's not so pie in the sky, but if it's not compelling to people, they're not going to do it. A lot of this starts because there's a lack of trust in leadership. Maybe there's been much change in leadership, or maybe it's been someone who's been in that position who people don't view as having the expertise to be in that position. Or perhaps there's been so many starts and stops that, oh, this is just another thing. And when that lack of trust in leadership is present, what often happens is it starts to spread throughout the organization where people are sharing all of these rumors and gossip and oh, don't do that. It's not going to work anyways. And so we get people, particularly new employees who come into an organization, they get bombarded with these people who are spreading all of this stuff, and they drink the bad Kool-Aid and nothing ever changes. So it just perpetuates. And that just makes it even that much more solidified that nothing is going to change. So we really need to think about how do we break that cycle. I know one organization that I work with really looked at this because there were many people who were giving out the bad Kool-Aid, and it got people thinking, what can we do differently to really get to the culture we want? So they looked at creating mentors for any new employee that was coming on board. And it could be from across the organization. There were people in leadership positions who others may not necessarily meet because their job is in a different department or something, but it started to create this opportunity for people to look at things differently, hear things directly from leadership. And it started to make that shift in culture because the new people were being indoctrinated in a way that they were exposed to the good things going on in the organization. Any organization is going to have some bad things, but we can get past that if we collectively want to move together. So as we think about this, take a moment and reflect about how are these cultures impacting your own organization? How is it impacting your ability to utilize the person-centered skills internally? Can you use them and use them in a way that you are being rewarded for that and not getting in trouble? Or are you trying new things and because of that hierarchical approach, you get your hand slapped for doing something different? And if we think about this from a systemic standpoint, how are we really moving these person-centered practices to the entire system? And what is the culture of the system, not just the organization, but the system? Are we seeing that blame culture? Are we seeing that vision derision? Are we seeing that crisis culture? Are we seeing that pervasive cynicism? If that's happening in the system, what are we doing to address it? So where are things in your world, in your organization, in the systems that you work in? Take a moment and reflect on that. I'm now going to pass it over to Mary Lou, who can help think about what are some ways we can assess where things are at, and so we can start to think about what needs to happen in order to move forward. Mary Lou?
Thanks so much, Bob. I am looking forward to this discussion about culture is one that is particularly one of my favorite pieces in really helping us to look at and understand how the things that we do, as well as the things that we don't do, and the things we say and the things we don't say sometimes, really contribute to the culture of not only your organization, but systemically. So as we've done so far in this series, we're going to take a quick look at the tool that is the instrument for self-assessment for states to determine your person-centered practices across your whole system. So let's take a quick look at the next slide. This one really begins with right at the very beginning. It's section 2.1 and 2.2, where we very intentionally are talking about the culture of your system in terms of person-centered practices, and also in terms of promoting cultural and linguistic competency through your person-centered practices. So we've learned a lot in the last couple of years on that particular, and you'll see then also in section 3.2, assessing and accessing cultural relevance and linguistic accessibility. So we'll talk about each of those briefly here during this section of the presentation. And I think what you'll see is that the assessment can really help you determine some of what Tanya and Michael and Bob have already discussed and some of what they'll be discussing later today. So on the next slide, we'll dig in a little bit deeper into section 2.1, which is changing the culture of the service delivery system. And so what you'll see here is that it evolves as all of the other sections had. There are kind of 5 progressive steps, if you will, in looking at how your system evolves from a passive understanding of person-centered culture to one that is much more intentional and one that you actively design and choose activities that really promote, but also anchor, I would say, the principles of person-centered practice into the culture. So this even goes as far as to talk about how we use narratives as well as data in things like licensing reviews and utilization reviews. Not only do we look at how person-centered plans reflect people's preferences, what's important to them, using that context to address what's important for them, but we also ask ourselves, how do all of the other aspects of the system, when they're engaging with your frontline staff, when you're engaging with your providers, do your state agency as well as your monitoring staff really promote and and demonstrate and look for person-centered practices. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about section 2.2, which is promoting the cultural and linguistic competence. One of the things we help to make sure that people understand right at the beginning with this is linguistic competence really talks about, it's not just translation, it's really far more than translation. It's understanding the communication patterns and behaviors of individuals. So this would also include people who may need, for example, text-to-speech assistance. So people who use software that supports text-to-speech, people who rely on American Sign Language to do most of their communicating with others. And do we exercise those practices that support people in whatever language and whatever linguistic needs they have for communicating fully on their own? There's a lot about status that is important to people, and status frequently is related to feeling respected for your communication methods. So in this particular section, we really talk about cultural competency, and we expand it to understanding linguistic competency and making sure that that's a basic fundamental principle and that we have built into all of our review process, all of our development process, our financial assumptions, anything that is related to how we support the system structure. Have we built in the assumptions around what people need to live their best life and to live the way their person-centered plan may describe they want their life to be? So there are value statements that are in here. We also talk a good bit about and can help you really recognize implicit bias and where our assumptions assume something that may be right for one cultural group, but really doesn't apply to another cultural group. So implicit bias really gets at those, when we talk about implicit bias, we're really talking about those underlying assumptions that are stereotyping and thus maybe leaving a whole group out or not accepting and respecting things that are very important to them because they're different. So looking at the assessment and service planning activities that reflect a cultural awareness, that's really what we're talking about there. So again, frequently when we say person-centered, people think the planning process, but we really need to also look at how does intake address those things? How do we assess for cultural and linguistic differences that may be very important to people? So that's section 2.2. And then on the next slide, just a few questions for you to really reflect on as a leader. So those of you here in this particular learning collaborative, you're leaders in your particular agency or your system. So thinking about what are the principles that are espoused by your agency. So in other words, what are the things that you say are your values or your principles? And then how do you as a leader actively demonstrate those principles? So it's one thing to have them on your website. It's one thing to have them as maybe even an introduction during your trainings, but do you look for and actively seek stories that demonstrate those principles and actually show them principles in action, so to speak? And as each time that you have an opportunity to be addressing or working with a group of people from your organization or from other agencies, do you take a moment, do you have the opportunity to actually point out the practices that support a person-centered culture? So the next section that you may be interested in and you may find helpful is goes into a little more detail around the cultural relevance and linguistic accessibility. You'll find this in section 3.2. So again, what you'll see is on the very first step, this is really related to an assumption that cultural and linguistic accessibility are related to translation. So you'll see that the first step in this is primarily around language translation and making sure that alternative communication options are available for people. That is kind of the floor. That's really step one. It is the minimum standard for looking at cultural relevance and linguistic accessibility. So what you'll see is that we move beyond, in one of the states that I've been working with actually recently, they have this great approach that people shouldn't have to ask for it. The materials should be designed with cultural and linguistic competency intended so that they don't have to ask, it's just available for people who need it. So even thinking about how that becomes available, how you commit to that, and what are the various cultural and linguistic needs of your community. It may be very different in some parts of your state than others. It may be different in where your organization operates. You may be in several, your company may be in several regions in your state, and you may recognize that there are presence of variations in the cultural needs and linguistic preferences of people. So really this is getting at moving beyond compliance with statute, moving beyond compliance with things like the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which indicate how technological needs and technologically communicated materials and rules or information are required to be minimally accessible on your website. But do we go above and beyond that to make sure that when people have needs for accessing information, their linguistic requirements are met without undue levels of extra steps that they have to take, so to speak. So we really look at, do you have a full strategy and have you thought through? So this is, and I might also say, this is very new to many organizations. So very few organizations move far beyond maybe step 2 at this point. But the intent here is to help you understand that it is, it's a progressive and activity that you'll engage in. It's a progressive strategy that may take some time to roll all of this out and to do it well. And one of the key pieces you'll see in step number 4, partnering with local communities to understand from them what is it that would really be helpful and how can we reach people with that cultural or ethnic background to make sure they feel welcomed and a part of the system. One other thing I would point out is the national class standards and ADA communication accommodations. They're available broadly. We can make links to those available to you. They're really terrific resources available through the federal government to look at, are we meeting the standards for what would be considered minimum accessibility for people in all healthcare services. And then on the last slide, for this particular section, we're really looking at just some more questions around how does your agency proactively provide information? Do you offer alternatives to people? And do you really look at moving beyond the basics of Section 508? And how do you actually intentionally engage people from diverse cultural, ethnic, or linguistic backgrounds? There are several states that we work with right now that have very intentional relationships that they have been building with, for example, the deaf community, and understanding how services can be made available and how people can be included in Zoom meetings with a few small changes that many people just don't even know about without having asked people who live that life and live that in that community. So one last thing we wanted to mention in terms of the person-centered systems assessment is alignment. So we've been mentioning this after the last couple of sessions. Really, at this point now, we've talked about leadership, mission, and values. We've discussed advocacy, trauma. We looked at outcomes. We talked about supporting your supporters, the caregivers in your system. And now we've started to address culture, which is one where we start bringing it all together. So we suggest that you either pause or at the end of today, sometime in your next very busy week, I'm sure, take a moment to reflect on and describe how do all of those parts of your system align with each other. So how does your culture perhaps present an opportunity to develop a strategy around designing all of these for consistency's sake? And where you have, what are the mechanisms? So in other words, do you have all staff meetings? Do you have a policy review team? Do you have a process development team? How about your quality management unit or organization? How do you use those to be the mechanism that creates alignment and checks to see, are we saying the same things in our mission when we work with advocates, when we design clinical services, as we train people in how to develop outcomes? do we have alignment, and are we speaking about person-centered practices in the same way and with the same voice? So thank you so much. And I think now I will be turning it back over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Now let's start thinking about that healthy culture and what can we do to start to create that? First of all, what are some of the attributes of a healthy culture? There's 10 of them that, again, Michael Hall looks at. And really quickly, we look at that there's a collegial spirit, that it's kind of an open door policy, that hierarchy really, it exists, but it exists for the good. It's how we get decisions made. There's a lot of brainstorming going on where decisions are made by management, but the discussion to make that happen happens internally and people are talking with one another. There's transparency. So what we think about is that people know what they need to know when they need to know it. And that helps build an understanding of what's going on with the organization. So we really want to think about how are things going in the organization you're working with? How is communication being shared in the organization? There needs to be an opportunity, as Michael was saying, that discontent is recognized and it's okay, because it's letting us know that people have some questions, people aren't sure about things. So let's look at how we can do things differently and have some discussions about that. It's openly encouraged because it lets us know where people are at and how can we collectively address it across the organization. They have their own perspective on how things are going. So collectively, how do we look at those perspectives for the good of the entire company? We want to look at long-term strategies and what is the perspective for making that happen. We really need short-term wins and long-term wins, and how does that perspective in making that happen support the organization's growth and stability? Change needs to happen incrementally. When we are trying new things and doing new things, we need to think about how is that working. And a lot of times in our system, we tend to say, we are making this change effective Monday, without maybe piloting it or trying different things. We really want to think about how we can incrementally address change and try things a little at a time so people get used to it, rather than changing the entire structure all at once. People aren't bound by their department or their silo. There's a lot of opportunity to work together to address issues and address concerns and to strategize about how to move things forward. The nice thing about collaboration, you probably will discover that someone's already got the answer to the question you have. And by talking with one another, we all have the answer. And that can be very helpful. Healthy cultures have discipline. And when we think about discipline, think about it from a standpoint of structure and boundaries. People know what those boundaries are and how to operate within those boundaries. And that helps us all know where the lines are before we cross the lines and find ourselves in trouble, which is what we tend to find in blame cultures. In healthy cultures, it's performance-based. You get ahead by what you know, not by who you know. And that helps us know that we are all being measured by the same yardstick. It's very even. There is recognition. People are recognized for their talents, for their contributions, for their accomplishments. A thank you can go a long way. And there is diversity. Again, there is a mixture of thoughts. There's a mixture of ideas, and it comes from very different people. So it's not just we have the middle-class white employees. We have all ethnicities represented. We have young people, we've got older people, we've got lots of different walks of life, all contributing to the organization. And that makes for a healthier organization because we're all in this together. Now, as I've gone through these, you may notice that they're pretty much just the opposite of that unhealthy culture. We really need to think about what are we doing to make that happen. And when we think about this healthy culture, from a learning culture perspective, there is a use of the vision, there is psychological safety, there is accountability, and there is partnership. These are 4 key elements that we will talk about in more detail to really think about how present are these in our own organizations? So in a learning culture, we really want to think about, is my learning valued if I'm doing the day-to-day work? How are we recording and organizing the learning that's going on? A lot of times we may be recording events that occur during our work, but are we capturing the learning that's going on? A lot of times our recording mechanisms are geared toward the process, but the process only tells us if we've met the process or not. It doesn't tell us what we are learning about the process. So are we really capturing the learning that is going on? You know, Richard Farson, who's a management consultant and associate of Carl Rogers, said, you know, if you put someone in a situation where they have responsibilities, but no skills, the outcome is abuse. So we really want to think about, what are we doing to make sure that people have the learning, they have the knowledge, they have the skills to do the work that is needed for the organization. And in order to capture that, we need to make sure that employees feel comfortable telling us they don't have the skills, or they don't feel that they've got the skills to do that, because that then lets us know what can we do to support that employee to really be the best they can be. I'm going to turn it over to Michael so he can talk to us about vision.
So, and vision keeps coming up, but it's the use of the vision that matters. First, do people see it as a compelling aspiration? Is it something that people feel is central to the work? Because if it is, then people will not only know it, but it guides their work. It tells them where the guardrails are, gives them some ideas about what they should be doing. And people need less direction when they're clear about the vision. But how do you judge the vision, the impact, and the actions that people take? The question is, are they efficient and are they effective? And if we mean they're effective, we mean that when we look at the outcomes, they help us move towards the vision, help us create things that assist us in that area. Or if they're efficient, they're helping us move with the least resources possible. Resources are always scarce. Being efficient and effective is a requirement if you're going to meet the vision. And when they're doing this work, they have to feel empowered to make changes that don't require permission. They have to feel like they're empowered to make changes that help people get better lives, improve a process, improves efficiency, and are inside the boundaries. And as people make those efforts, we continue to look at the learning. So what Bob talked about with learning is central to having this work, because people need to put the learning into action to enhance and improve the efforts to get a learning cycle going where people are using what's been learned, see what worked, what didn't work, and look at how they can improve effectiveness and efficiency.
So we know that one of the aspects of a healthy learning culture is psychological safety. And that's the belief that you're not going to get into trouble. You're not going to be punished or humiliated for speaking up when you have ideas, even if they're ideas that might be divergent from others. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you've made a mistake and you need to talk about it. So it's a shared belief that gets held by the members of a team. And it's really a commitment to not embarrassing one another or rejecting one another or punishing others when they do speak up. And one of the keys of psychological safety and how we create it is that we make sure that people feel comfortable voicing their opinions and they don't fear being judged by others. So what we might find ourselves doing is helping our team learn how to develop that safe environment in partnership with one another. We might create a few ground rules about how we interact with one another. So one example might be, just like we do in meetings, often we'll say we want to make sure people have the opportunity to express their full thoughts. So let's not interrupt one another. So we're creating a space and an expectation that people can speak freely and openly with one another. A robust learning culture doesn't exist in isolation. So it's a constellation of many attributes that have to be present. And the first among those is really psychological safety. And inherent in that learning culture is the idea that we learn as much from what doesn't work as what we learn from what does work. So it has to be safe to report on those kinds of things that aren't working. And it needs to be safe to put forward ideas that maybe will never work. Maybe they're not a good fit, or they may need more effort or more resources to be successful. But we don't want people to feel shut down before they even posit the ideas. This also really implies that those who are making the efforts know where it's okay to try things and where it's not. And that's where our donut comes into play again. So this can really help us with that culture of accountability where performance expectations are clarified up front. People know where they have an opportunity to use some judgment and creativity. And they know also what their core responsibilities are that have to be done in a non-negotiable, very specific way. So the distinctions have to be clear, and the best time to do that is ahead of when crises arise. And that also implies that the work is being done in a culture of partnership that's rooted in respect and in trust of one another. If you have accountability, you have clarity about the donut. So that means that we've clarified where the boundaries are, and we might find other tools that help us create clarity. Sometimes that happens in job descriptions or in team meetings, or there may be process kinds of tools that we use that help people understand where they're supposed to act and where they're not. But people will be much more creative if trust is there. If we see people not ever stepping out of the core of their role, so not stepping out of the core of the donut, that's a really good indication that there's low trust. That may be specific to the organization. It may, as I said, be something that people brought with them from another experience, but it's something that needs to be addressed. Partnership is definitely part of how we create a learning culture. So if we're going to help someone, for example, be more connected to their community, we need to be able to try things together. So it may mean that people who wouldn't ordinarily work with someone might find themselves working with them because we're partnering for that outcome that makes the most sense in a person's life. And it can only happen where we have trust, but also invitation, where we make room for one another. So if you are a provider, or if you are a manager, if you are someone who works directly with people, you all have the same need for respect, and also to have room at the table to share the things that you bring to the table, to share the things that you're good at. And if we don't have respect for one another, what happens is we break that chain of trust.
So based upon what we've talked about, we really need to think about how do we make this shift from perhaps where we've been to where we want to go. And knowing that culture is a huge ship that takes a while to make that turn. So what can we do to build upon these positive cultures that we've presented today? And while we're doing that, to reduce the impact of those negative cultures. As we are making this happen, how can we build in person-centered practices to really create the partnership, learning, and accountability that we want to see in what we do? You know, and I often will ask organizations that I'm working with as we are going through things, and a barometer for me is what happens when you're in a crisis? When you're in a crisis, do you start to use the new methods and thought processes around person-centered approaches? Or do you revert back to the old way of doing things because that's what you feel most comfortable with? A crisis can really help us figure out where are we along this path to making the change happen. So as we think about this, I'm going to ask you to look at your own organization, your own system. And in order to do that, it requires change. And we mentioned this a while ago about a change agent and a change target. And when we think about this, are you a change agent where you're an advocate for change, yet you don't personally change what you do? This person-centered stuff, it's great. You go ahead and do it. I'm going to keep doing what I do. Now, being a change agent isn't a bad place to be. It gets things moving. But if we really want change to happen, particularly with culture, we need to be a change target. And when we are a change target, we personally take a look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what changes do I need to make to really be the change I want to see happen? Be the role model for change. So it may mean you need to change your approach when you are working with employees. You may need to have more of an open door policy. You may need to look at breaking down that hierarchical structure in having conversations with folks rather than having a hierarchical structure for making decisions. Change is hard. So we really need to think about how are we going to make that change happen. But before we can do that, we need to identify where things are at in our organization. So while this is a pause and reflect, and I'd like you to start doing this here, we'll also give this to you as a handout, and we will discuss it when we come back together for our World Café session. So take a moment and think about what behaviors do you see in your workplace that really demonstrate what we've been talking about? What are those things that promote status and are rewarded in the organization? What sort of things are looked down upon or diminish status? And really, what sustains those behaviors and actions? Very beginning of our presentation today, we talked about the fact that culture really are those things that encourages or discourages the way we approach things. What is acceptable and what is not acceptable. These are things that are underlying currents in the organization. So what are your underlying currents in your organizations and your systems? And once again, we will talk about this when we come back together. So our next steps to really think about what is needed to support and sustain a healthy work culture in your organization. Think about who needs to be engaged. Those circles of control that we've been having you do can help you identify where you can become that change target and where you need to be a change agent to encourage others to make some changes. We will look at sharing this information when we come back together on August 22nd, and we will be meeting at 2:00 Eastern time, and we look forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or thoughts, please reach out to us. Here's our contact information, and Debbie Paul is also available if you have any questions. Please use Teams, and we can be in conversation with each other in between now and the World Café. I want to thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you on the 22nd. Thanks.